The best thing you can do is teach people to write, because there's no difference between that and thinking. And one of the things that just blows me away about universities is that no one ever tells students why they should write something. It's like, well, you have to do this assignment. Well, why are you writing? Well, you need the grade. It's like, no, you need to learn to think, because thinking makes you act effectively in the world. Thinking makes you win the battles you undertake, and those could be battles for good things. If you can think and speak and write, you are absolutely deadly. Nothing can get in your way. So that's why you learn to write. It's like, and I can't believe that people aren't just told that. It's like, it's the most powerful weapon you can possibly provide someone with. And I mean, I know lots of people who've been staggeringly successful and watched them throughout my life. I mean, those people, you don't want to have an argument with them. They'll just slash you into pieces. And not in a malevolent way. It's like, if you're going to make your point and they're going to make their point, you better have your points organized, because otherwise you are going to look like and be an absolute idiot. You are not going to get anywhere. And if you can formulate your arguments coherently and make a presentation, if you can speak to people, if you can lay out a proposal, God, people give you money, they give you opportunities, you have influence. That's what you're at university for. And so that's what you do. Is you're in English, right? Yeah, in languages anyways. It's like, yeah, teach people to be articulate, because that's the most dangerous thing you can possibly be. So, and that's motivating if people know that. It's like, well, why are you learning to write? Because here's your sword, here's your M16, right? Here's your bulletproof vest. Like, you learn how to use them. But it's an endless mystery to me why that isn't made self-evident. So that's the sort of thing that can drive you mad trying to sort out. It's like there's a conspiracy to bring people into the education system to make them weaker. So I guess that keeps the competition down. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. If your students are stupid, they're not going to challenge you. The reason that you come to university to be educated is because there is nothing more powerful than someone who is articulate and who can think and speak. It's power. And I mean power of the best sort. It's authority and influence and respectability and competence. And so you come to university to craft your highest skill. And your highest skill is to be found in articulated speech. And if you're a master at formulating your arguments, you win everything. And better than that, when you win everything, everyone around you wins too. Because to transform yourself into, let's consider your transformation into something approximating the logos. It means you shine a light on the whole world. Well, there's nothing more exciting to do than that. There's nothing better you can possibly do. And to think that you're coming to university to be, trained to have a job, it's like, great, that's a hell of a lot better than being unemployed and covered with Cheeto dust while you're snacking away in front of your video game in the basement. But it's not and I don't have anything against video games, by the way, but but it's hardly a triumphant call to being in the world, and that's what university should be calling forth. It's like, God, you people, I know what Harvard students are like. I taught here for 5 years. You people are spectacular. You're spectacular. You're all capable of being world beaters. You transform yourself into something that's articulated and sensible and grounded in history and knowledgeable and wise, man. You can do anything you want, and hopefully anything you want for good. Because if you have any sense, everything you want to do would be for the good, because there's nothing more compelling or meaningful or useful in combating the tragedy of life than to struggle with all your soul on behalf of the good. I did a talk at Harvard 4 years ago, and I pointed out two things to the students in the audience. One was that a tremendous amount of civilization and effort had gone into producing the institution that they were now part of, and that everyone who was part of that institution was hoping that they would come there and learn everything they possibly could that was relevant and important, and that they would be the best possible people they could be, and they would go out in the world and do as much good as they possibly could. That was the essential mission of the enterprise. And that was really the case. And also that learning to write in particular was going to make them more powerful than they could imagine. And a number of students came up to me afterwards and said, I really wish someone would have said that to us when we first came here. And it's the writing part of that. I kind of got obsessed with that when I was working as a professor. And I'm working on a piece of software right now to help, which will launch soon, to help people write. Because what I observed in my own career, and it's so interesting, the parallelism is so interesting, but not surprising, is that nothing can stop you if you can write. And it's for the reasons you just laid out. It's like when you write, you make a case for something, whatever it happens to be. And if you make the best case, well, then you win and you get whatever it is that you're aiming at. And so, you said, maybe that's why I didn't ask you why you went into English. I guess that might have been the reason, is that the utility of learning to write is so self-evident to me that it could pass by without question. But it's also interesting to think about how it fits into this broader, well, let's say at least partially military/strategic way of looking at things. You described the intense relationship between marshaling your arguments properly, getting everything in order on the page, and making strategic progress truly in the military sense, that those things are tied together very, very precisely. And it's obviously your ability to communicate as well that's well, look what it's done. You have your podcast, you have your YouTube channel, you have your books, many of which you self-published. So that ability to communicate I just can't understand why it's not presented, especially, not entirely, but especially to adventurous, well, let's say young men. We could say young people. You're adventurous, you want to make a mark, is you bloody well better learn how to write. Because if you learn how to write, well, then you can think and you can communicate your thoughts. So not only are you deadly strategically, you become extremely convincing. And then you can go and do anything you want and no one will stop you. And that's never told to people. And I don't really understand why. You hear the pen is mightier than the sword, which is just a cliche unless it's fleshed out. But the reason, you laid out the reasons perfectly.
Yeah.
You have to communicate what happened as well as having it had it happen. It's upsetting to me, I would say, that young people in particular aren't stringently instructed that that literacy makes them powerful in every way they can possibly imagine, except the absolutely immediate. And so it's just sad to me that it's not sold in that manner. You want to be weak? Stay illiterate. You want to be strong? It's like, put yourself together physically. Fair enough, man. Get brave and street smart. But then you could add some literacy to that and you're an unstoppable machine. I love reading for that reason. I could pick my peers too, which I really loved. It's like, well, I have these people around me, but then there's these people who've lived before me and in different places, and I can set them up on my shelf. I can enter into their world and I can benefit from everything they've thought and saturate myself with that person. It's very disruptive, especially if the person that you're reading has a mind that's more powerful and more well-developed than your own. I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche spun me around for about 3 years, and I was reading Jung at the same time intensely, and the same thing, it was very disruptive, but unbelievably useful to try on other people like that. And you get the benefit of their entire life distilled into their book. It's 30 years of work. I read this one book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which it's a great scientific work. I think it's the greatest neuropsychological work of the last 50 years. It's a very hard book. I think it has 1,800 references, something like that. And this guy, Jeffrey Gray, he actually read all those references and he understood them. And so it took me 6 months to read the book, but I got an entire education out of it. I got to experience in 6 months what it took him 30 years to learn. Like, what a gift that is. It's unbelievable. If you're feeling resentful about something, there's a shadow that reveals itself in two ways. One is it's a pointer to your immaturity. You need to be more disciplined. You have set goals, hypothetically, and if you haven't, then you're under the sway of someone else, or you're undisciplined and unintegrated and incoherent, which is all shadow life in some sense. You're pursuing short-term impulsive goals because you haven't thought it through. You're pursuing goals that other people have established for you. You're not pursuing any goals at all because you're too nihilistic to believe that life has any purpose. All that's shadowy, let's say. But maybe you have set goals and now you're resentful about all the work that you have to do in order to acquire those goals, and maybe that manifests itself as a broad-scale critique of social structure. That's immaturity, and so you can delve into that and you can find out where you're still a spoiled child and hopefully take action to rectify that. Or you may find that you're being compelled to do something that violates your integrity, and you need to stand up for yourself and say something that you don't want to say. And then you may have to learn how to incorporate your anger into your actions so that you learn how to say no when you need to say no. And so that actually means that you're furthering your ethical pursuit as a consequence of integrating your shadow rather than deviating from it. Aggression, which can be repressed, sexuality, lust, let's say, which can be repressed. Those things are extremely useful servants when they're integrated into the whole. If you're without aggression and anger and incapable of it, that doesn't mean that you're on a good path and that anger knocks you off it. That can happen, but it's much more appropriate and sophisticated to note that the probability that you're going to pursue a higher good is magnified by your integration of all your emotional and motivational states, even the ones that can cause a tremendous amount of trouble when they're left to manifest themselves in isolation. You're way too agreeable. Well, I would say you could practice saying what you really believe, that you can take a vow to tell the truth. And that will make you much less agreeable. Agreeable people are perfectly willing to sacrifice what they know to be the case to maintain short-term social harmony. And it's not so much that they repress what they think, it's often that they don't even allow themselves to fully realize what they think. So commitment to the truth can make an agreeable person, will stop an agreeable person from being a doormat. I mean, if you're in a relationship and the person is irritating you with something they've done, you might be highly motivated not to say anything about it because you want to keep the peace. You don't want to upset them. You don't want the conflict. That's all characteristic of high agreeableness. But once you decide to tell the truth, then if you're annoyed, you don't get to hide it. You don't get to assume you're right. You don't get to grab the person by the shirt collar and say, look, I'm annoyed and you're wrong. You get to say, I'm irritated about this situation and I need to think through that irritation to find out if I have a problem or if you have a problem, or if we both have a problem, or if it's a different problem altogether. But you can't hide the fact that the problem has made itself manifest. And so if you're agreeable and you tell the truth about your emotional state, that will propel you out of that agreeableness by necessity. With regards to anger, I don't know towards what or how to get rid of it. Well, something a cognitive behavioral therapist might recommend is for a week, and maybe this is already a therapy you've been through, but this exercise is generally quite useful. First, you have to note when you're angry and admit to that. And maybe you have to practice that. So you have to decide, I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to see when I'm angry, and I'm going to admit to it. At least to begin with, without judgment. I'm just going to observe it. I'm going to allow myself to observe it. Then you have to allow yourself to see what angry thoughts you have. And you can ask yourself that. What angry thoughts do I frequently have? They'll likely come to mind, maybe many of them. You can jot all those down. Those are ones you're familiar with. And then you can notice when you're angry, and you can ask yourself, well, what am I thinking right at this moment? What angry thoughts am I thinking? And some of them might be quite shocking. You might also manifest themselves in destructive fantasies. You know, maybe you have a fantasy of grabbing somebody by a shirt collar and pushing them up against a wall, or dumping, hot coffee on your boss, or some impulse towards aggression that might manifest itself as a flashing fantasy. And perhaps one that you're shocked by and don't want to admit. You don't want to admit to the existence of it, but you need to see what's happening first in your own imagination if you're going to cope with it. It's also possible that a fair bit of the anger that you have is actually useful if you could just find out what it is and what it's directed toward. So the first tack is to explore the anger. What gives rise to it? What situations give rise to it? What people give rise to it? What are you doing when it happens? And what is the phenomenology of the anger? How does it make itself manifest in image, fantasy, and thought? And then now you have an anger inventory. Is anger in this situation warranted? What steps do I have to take in order to become less angry? And sometimes that might be an adjustment of an internal psychological adjustment. Sometimes it might require changes in the world. Maybe you're in a relationship that's oppressive, and you have been for a long time. And the way to fix that isn't to adjust your attitude, although it could be, but it might be that it's time to get out of the relationship. And so, differentiation. When are you angry? What elicits it? Why are you angry? Who are you angry at? What are the nature of the angry thoughts? What are the nature of the angry fantasies? All of that. You have to get that out where you can see it. And you have to walk through it. And you can do that by yourself. You can do that while writing. You can produce counter thoughts. So if you're angry about something, you could outline the reasons why anger is not productive, or you could outline the reasons why it's productive and the reasons it's not productive for a full exploration of the issue. Social worker, superhero, very physically tough person, and a very masculine male, but a social worker and very caring. And he's been very helpful to me, and he's been walking with me every day, and people are stopping me. And, the other day, this guy walked by us on the street, and he was pretty run down. He was probably in his mid-40s, and he's kind of street person looking, And he stopped, and he looked at me, and he came over and he said, "I love you." And I walked away, and my friend said, "You sure have a lot of men coming up to you and saying that they love you." And I said, "Oh, yeah. I don't know. I just don't know what to make of it. The behavior is so completely unusual." And, my wife too, she said she's seen a whole different side of men, especially since we started touring, because of this happening. Because generally when people approach me, and they're not invariably men, but they probably are 70% of the time, they're very polite and very careful. And she said that showed her a whole side of men that she didn't even know existed. And so it's something. But I do believe that people, I do believe that my experience has been that there isn't anything that, I guess two things. There isn't anything that's more rewarding than trying to do things right. All other forms of reward pale by comparison. They're not even in the same conceptual universe. And there's nothing that's more adventurous than telling the truth. You have no idea what will happen to you if you tell the truth. And so if you're looking for an adventure, boy, that's an adventure. A fair bit of both of my last two books, but I would say particularly the last one, Beyond Order, the new one, is what would you say, encouragement to people to watch themselves, to pay attention, not to think, but just to watch. It's like, and so one chapter is called, I think it's chapter 5, is called Do Not Do What You Hate. And what does it mean? Well, it doesn't mean, geez, I hate getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning to get ready for work. That just means that you're not very disciplined, or maybe that it might mean something deeper. But I'd start with lack of discipline before, rearranging your whole life. Because you might say, well, I hate getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning no matter what I'm doing, and then it's not your job. I don't mean don't do difficult things. I mean, watch yourself, and if you see that you're doing things that make you hate yourself, then consider the cost of continuing. Just notice, because you're reporting to yourself, just like you just said. In some sense, that wasn't a voluntary decision. You noticed that you couldn't breathe unless you discussed this issue. It's like, well, why is that? You don't know. You can't control it even. I mean, you can not do it and pay the consequences, but you can't say to yourself easily, well, that's stupid. I should be able to breathe. Just because I haven't said this thing, that shouldn't stop me from breathing. But there it is. And the wise people that I've read, often associated with the establishment of the Christian church, actually, this seems to be something that was a continual topic of discussion, noted continually that we do things that we can't control, and we're subject to forces that we can't control, and those are forces that are associated with our own destiny, I suppose, certainly our own conscience. You just have to watch. You find out who you are. I'm the person who has to say this. Why? I don't know exactly, but I know that if I don't do it, there's going to be a price. I had 3 clients, all whose political beliefs, by the way, ranged across a wide spectrum, all of who'd been bullied to the point of breakdown in their workplace. And they kept being asked to do things that violated their conscience. And, partly they didn't exactly know how to, it's not, you should stand up, but it's not that easy. And it's not that easy to figure out when you should do it. But you should do it when, if you're going along with something that violates your conscience, then you lessen yourself. You're starting to pay a big price then. And so at some point you have to think, and this is something I walked through with my clients all the time when they were trying to make a decision. Everyone looks at the costs of making a decision, but almost no one looks at the costs of not making the decision. And the reason for that is you're sitting there right now and the sky isn't falling on you. And so you're not calculating the costs of sitting there because nothing's happening. And then if you decided to do something different, you might calculate the costs of doing that, but you've already zeroed out the costs of inertia. But they aren't zero. There's no zero cost. There's risk here and there's risk here. And you don't like that idea because you want security, and no bloody wonder. It's no wonder you want security. But when you're making a decision, you need to reawaken the costs of inertia. I mean, those are opportunity costs, let's say, something like that. There are ways they are formally considered, but just going along as you are when everything is changing around you is also a costly decision. And so if you know that, you think, well, there's danger here and there's danger here, then that, weirdly enough, that frees you up, because then you can pick the danger that you prefer. Now, the price you pay is the realization that there's no security down either road. And you have to wake up to that now and then in your life. It's very unpleasant. It's not surprising people don't do it. But again, the costs of failing to do it are worse. In chapter 11, which is do not allow yourself to become deceitful, arrogant, or resentful, it's kind of a summary chapter of everything I've ever written, I would say. I kind of outline the reasons why people become deceitful, arrogant, and resentful. And we have our reasons. It's in some sense, it's a miracle that it doesn't happen all the time. And so I say, well, here's the problem. Death chases you, you're mortal, and illness will be a part of your life and a part of the lives of people you love. And it will be terrible, maybe beyond your imagining. You're stuck with that, man. And culture, there's a tyrannical aspect. It crushes you and turns you into a cog and maybe destroys the best in you to some degree. You're stuck with that. And then Christ, you're just a massive contradictions and trouble. You can't get yourself organized. You're doing all sorts of things you don't want to do and not doing the things you should do, and, putting obstacles in your path just so you can trip over them. Well, there's the landscape. Well, why would you turn to the dark side, let's say, in the face of that? It's like, no wonder, obviously. But it doesn't help. It seems to make everything worse. So, and it doesn't seem, if you're objecting to the fact that things are bad, it doesn't seem that making them worse is a tenable solution. It's an attractive solution at times because people think deeply. Oh, to hell with this. It's so awful that I'll just add to the misery out of spite. And man, if you don't see the compulsion of that argument, either you're not, I don't know, maybe you're fortunate. You're sheltered. Maybe you're saint-like. That would be good. But it and you see this in clinical practice all the time. Voluntary confrontation with what is threatening and unknown tends to be curative. And not always. There are mistakes people make. So for example, you often see these trauma teams rush in to talk to people just after, say, a mass shooting or some kind of terrorist attack. And it does not help people to have them review the trauma that they're currently experiencing. Not unless it's problem-solving oriented. It can just make it worse. But if it's an old memory, well, then voluntary recall and explicit reformulation seems to be useful. Or at least it's better than anything else we know. His proposition was that every ideal is a judge. And that makes perfect sense because an ideal is something to which you aspire. And the gap between you and that ideal, if it's your ideal, is felt as judgment. And so that's one of the reasons people are very afraid to have an ideal, to make it. That's why I wrote, do not hide things in the fog. It's like, well, you should lay out an ideal. You should pursue an ideal. Why wouldn't you? Well, when you make your ideal explicit, it turns into your judge. Well, then you can listen to that judge and move forward and transform. But, it's pretty damn harsh. Because especially to begin with, you posit an ideal, especially if you're in a mess. God, every bit of you is being judged as unworthy.
One of the things that you wrote was really powerful for me to read because to me, I think it described my snitch, my round chaos, that thing that I'm seeking underneath the games that I'm playing. And so I'm going to read this little snippet here. Who could you be? You could be all that a man or woman might be. You could be the newest avatar in your own unique manner of the great ancestral heroes of the past. What is the upper limit to that? We do not know. Our religious structures hint at it. How would someone who determined to take full responsibility for the tragedy and malevolence of the world manifest itself? The ultimate question of man is not who we are, but who we could be. That's it for me. I mean, I read that, I was like, yep, that's it. There's the snitch with its wings and its golden, mercurious allure that I'm really chasing underneath all of this. And I enjoy all these other things, but
who could you be?
Exactly.
You see that in children. I watch little children play, and what they're doing, they're they're attempting to grow forward, but they toy with identities. My little granddaughter, I wrote about her in this book too. It's so funny watching her. She had Pocahontas, the Disney movie, and she had a Pocahontas doll, and she watched that movie a number of times. And then it's been a year now. She's only 3.5. For a whole year, she has two names, Scarlett and Ellie. And one's her middle name, but she's called one or the other, and seems to be perfectly comfortable with both. If you ask her if she's Ellie, she'll say yes. And if you ask her if she's Scarlett, she'll say yes. But if you ask her if she's Pocahontas, she'll also say yes. And then if you ask her if she is Scarlett, Ellie, or Pocahontas, she'll say she's Pocahontas. And she's been insisting on that for a whole year. And so she's playing out this role. I don't know how much of her imagination is devoted to it, but enough for this trip. Like that's, if you're, how old are you? 40 something?
Just turned 40.
Yeah, okay. So, imagine that you had a fictional identity for 15 years. That's approximately the same relative length of time. And the kids, they weave up a fantasy world, and then they play out an identity in that. And then they weave out another fantasy world, and they play out an identity with that. And they shape that identity by their interactions with other children and adults. And hopefully they find an identity that suits them, that other people also accept. Because your identity has to be something that other people accept, or it isn't going to work for you. But that's all part of this exploration of who they could be. It's the play is, in fact, the exercising of that realm of possibilities. If you're a clinical psychologist, you don't want to steal people's accomplishments from them, which is partly why you don't give advice exactly. So maybe someone is trying to decide whether they should get married, and maybe you have an opinion, but probably you shouldn't, because as a psychologist, let's say, because except perhaps in extreme cases, the person has to discover what they need to do for themselves so that they can discover it again in the future, so that they can learn to discover things for themselves. And you don't want to give advice, because then if they do something good, you can take credit for it. And I don't want to take credit for the accomplishments that people make as a consequence of, what would you say, putting the ideas they encounter in my books into practice. They put them into practice, and good for them. And so when I meet people in the street, that's what I tell them. It's like, okay, you did this specific thing, good for you. And, I provided some impetus, and I'm happy about that and pleased to do that. But I certainly don't want the credit. But I do feel the obligation. I think it is part of what made me ill. I think it is because, as a psychologist, I dealt with people's innermost secrets for decades. But it was kind of limited, right? It was 13 people or so a week, maybe up to 20, which is still quite a few people, but it's not an inordinate number of people. It's a bounded number of people. And then I had my other work that I could escape into, let's say, and I wasn't carrying it with me, the burden of the lives of the people that I was intertwined with. But then all of a sudden I started to experience that the longing, I suppose, in some sense, on a much greater scale, and that's been difficult to digest. The misery, and that's so common in people's lives, but even worse than that, the degree to which it requires almost nothing to rectify it in an important way. There's many people who are starving for a word of encouragement, and if you provide that, they run with it, and that's great, but it also reveals this terrible unnecessary lack. It's like, well, why weren't they encouraged to begin with? And that's a deep hole to fall down, and because you can never stop answering that question once you start asking it. And it has something to do with the fundamental difficulty that everyone who's human has in valuing their own existence because of its imperfections and finitude. And it's a very complex question. And then to see that played out thousands of times, these brief encounters I have with people, they're very intense. You know, people tell me things in those encounters that they don't tell anyone else, or they tell very few people, or maybe they've never told anyone in their life. This young man stopped me on the street the other day, and he was looking a bit beat up. And he came up and he said, he was very shy, and he said, well, you know, your lectures have been very helpful. And I asked him what his name was, and that usually helps people set them at ease. And then I said, well, what helped you? And he was quite hesitant. He didn't exactly know how to formulate what he was doing, but I could see that he was very scared to say anything that he had done well, because his experience had been that he'd never been encouraged when he did something well. And so, you know, you can really punish someone if they come up to you and say they did something good that was actually good, and then you punish them or ignore them. It really hurts them. And that happens to children all the time. And it certainly had happened to this young man. So he's very hesitant to tell me what he had done that was good. And, you know, he told me, and I listened, and I said, look, this is, as far as I'm concerned, that what you did was really good. And he just lit up, you know, and that's great that he lit up, but it's terrible that it hadn't happened to him before. It's really terrible. And then I see this tied in with a cultural pathology, that a variety of cultural pathologies that are manifesting themselves at the current time. You know, the idea that organized masculine activity is by definition some kind of power-centered tyranny, and the corollary that any sort of ambition on the part of young men any ambition towards achievement is somehow integrally tied up with tyrannical power. It's so demoralizing for young men. They don't know how to defend themselves against that. And the idea, and you know, it's often leveled, the accusation is often leveled by people who've never had a relationship with a male in their life that was actually fulfilling and worthwhile. And then that all plays out in the public. Domain. It's really awful to see, and I can see it. So it's hard to see that. I mean, I'm thrilled that I am in a position to do something about it. It's so great. You know, that's something else I can tell people now too, you know, because you say, well, what should you do with your life? And like, I've seen people who've accomplished anything that you can imagine in terms of accomplishments. And I can say clearly that I've never seen anything as rewarding as the consequences of forthright speech, the opportunity to be of genuine service to other people. There's way more reward in that than in any of the things that people chase in a more finite and limited way.
Like, I have a painting in my office called Dead Mentors. It's me in the painting with 8 other characters in a vault. We're having a conversation. It's a debate between 2 books, Communist Manifesto and Atlas Shrugged. So it's a discourse. They're having a debate, they're having a discourse. It's very interesting characters, but you can tap into somebody. You're like, okay, I can tap into.
Who are the characters? Who are the characters in the painting?
I just moved to Florida. So I got John F. Kennedy, I got Einstein, I got the Shah of Iran, Lincoln, MLK, Tupac, Ayrton Senna, Milton Friedman, and one other character I'm forgetting.
Great. So that's so good, because look, and you can surround yourself with these great minds, and you can what would you say, in some sense, you can choose them as your peers voluntarily, dead or not, right? It's a form of ancestor worship in some sense. And I mean that in a deep sense. And you can do that's one of the advantages of that is education, as far as I'm concerned, is pick your peers. And this instinct we have to find someone to admire, that's the deepest of religious instincts, and it's unbelievably deep in human beings. And and we have this mimicry, this capacity for mimicry that's an integral part of our cognitive architecture, and it's the precursor to thought. And we do identify, you notice you admire someone, that is the instinct to mimic, because to admire is then to want to be that, and that's the action of the moral instinct. It finds a target in the world and it says, well, I could be like that. But at first it says, this person is attractive, or this person is compelling. It grabs you. And that's the instinct for further development. It's a very positive thing. It can be a very positive thing.
When you were going through your moment the last 12 months, who were you saying, at least he overcame it, I can? Here's what he went through was worse. Was there anybody you would go to?
Well, there has been throughout my life all sorts of intellectual figures, figures from my own life as well. I found many things about my father extremely admirable, and still do. My mother as well. And so I was fortunate to have people in my immediate environment who played that role for me, and that's a huge gift. I have all sorts of intellectual idols, I would say, and there are people whose work I've read deeply, and that's been extremely useful to me. And then that shades into the consideration of religious figures at some point. And I've spent a lot of time studying religious thinking and trying to, what religious thinking is in some sense is the collective attempt to specify the ideal for mimicry. So imagine that you have those 8 figures in your painting. So imagine there's something about each of those people that you found compelling and admirable. So then imagine that you could abstract out from that what was compelling and admirable and make one person out of that was sort of the union of all those 8. It was everything good about those 8 people brought into one person. Well, that's approaching a divine figure. And when you hear Christian statements, for example, like Christ is the King of Kings, that actually means something technical from a psychological perspective. What it means is that, and I'm not speaking in religious terms here precisely, although it shades into the religious, is that a religious ideal is in fact the abstracted representation of what is admirable as such. And it's extremely useful to have that made into an abstraction to some degree too, because it also means that you then have something that you're responsible to. So let's say and you've done this with your painting, you have these 8 people who you're now, what would you say? You're responsible to them. You're accountable to them. You're accountable to their spirit. And so now your conscience can speak with their collective voice, and it can tell you when you're less than you could be. And then you can use that to guide you to manifest that spirit that's embodied in those 8 people. And that's a pathway to further growth. To stand up straight with your shoulders back is to open yourself up to the world. You're not in the defensive crouch of a prey animal, technically speaking. And that is the circuitry that's governing posture. It's prey versus predator, something like that. And to stand up like that is to expose yourself to the world, but in a bring it on sort of manner. Not precisely combative, but let's say courageous. And your posture announces that. And it doesn't just announce that to other people. It announces that to yourself, and it can be one of those things that can start a virtuous cycle occurring, which is partly why it's taught in the military. You get these guys that come in, they're all slumped over, they don't know how to stand up, they're looking at their feet, their necks are bent, like even if they're good-looking men, they don't look good because they're all crunched over. You see people like this on the street all the time. They could be perfectly attractive, except they're completely huddled in. They need to stand up and stretch themselves out, and then they can breathe too. And that's a competent stance. One of the things that the critics of the modern West don't understand about hierarchies is that, first of all, they're everywhere. They're inevitable. If you're going to have a distinction of value between things, you have a hierarchy. And if you don't want to get rid of the distinction of values between things, because then you don't have anything to do. That's foolish. You can't live that way. So I say, well, the hierarchies are based on power. It's like, no, they're not. They're based on competence. And there isn't anything more powerful than competence. But power isn't tyranny. It's not brutality. It's not threat. It might be the hint of all those things. Because I don't think you can be fully competent without being able to hint at those things. But hierarchies in the West are fundamentally based on competence. It doesn't mean they're not flawed, because we miss the mark lots. And there's lots of reasons why perfectly competent people don't attain the position that they deserve and that they should have for their benefit and everyone else's. The hierarchies are tainted by corruption, but fundamentally they're based on competence. So like if a lobster gets defeated in a fight, then he's statistically more likely to lose the next fight than you would guess from a tally of his previous victories. So that's the first thing. If you lose, you increase your risk of further loss. But if you win, you increase your risk of future gains. That's a very important principle. It's a crucially important principle. It governs life. But yeah, if you take a lobster and he gets all defeated and he's off pouting and won't fight anymore because he's, having a bad day, and you inject him with serotonin, essentially give him antidepressants, it's the same thing, then he'll straighten up and he'll go out and have another scrap. It's like, and I read that, I don't know, it's probably at least 10 years ago when I was reading about, the neurophysiology of these neurochemical systems. That's why I got onto it. It was another thing that just blew me away. I thought, really, you're kidding? That circuit is that old? It's that old? That's way before there were trees, eh? Yeah. That's how long ago that is. And so hierarchy is a patriarchal construction. How about no? How about that's wrong? It's seriously wrong. Right? So one of the things I've suggested to my viewers, this is the men in particular, but not just the men, you should be the most reliable person at your father's funeral. That's a good goal, man. That's a good goal, because everyone's broken in a situation like that. And you adding to that brokenness and misery, you're going to be grieving, like no doubt about it, and no kidding. But there's a time to step forward with some character, and it's the same thing. You're going to be at someone's deathbed. You're going to be quibbling with your siblings while you're doing that? While your parents dying? It's like, it's bad enough that they're dying. That's tragedy, right? But you can turn that into hell, no problem. You just get a bunch of people with no character around a deathbed, and it's like, well, it's bad enough, but that turns it into something like hell. And that happens in people's lives all the time. It's like, character is everything. So, and that's why the wise people of our past tradition insisted upon that. They say, well, don't lie. Well, why not? Well, it destroys your character. Well, so what? Well, then you turn suffering into hell. Is that what you want? Maybe, because people will want that. But I would say, walk away from people like that, right? I think we could think about that also in terms of the conversation about meaning that we started to have. It's like, if you win all the time, that's meaningless. Because, and you think, why? Because you want to win. It's like, yeah, fair enough. So why would winning all the time become meaningless? It's because your theory of winning isn't sophisticated enough. Because here's how you win. You play the game to win, but while you're playing, you play in a way so that you get better at the game, right? Because you're going to play a bunch of games. Well, it's even more than that. You play the game to win, but you play it so that you get better at the game. Okay, fine, that makes sense. So you want to push yourself, right? Because that's how you get better, and so you need competition to push yourself. So you need to have the risk of loss, because otherwise you won't do it. But here's an even better way of thinking about it. You play the game so that you don't only get better at that game, but you get better at the entire set of possible games. And that's what you do when you're a good sport. like, well, so how do you do that? Well, partly you find the proper level of competition, right? So you want to be pushed so that you will make the effort necessary to remove what's useless about yourself and to help foster the growth of what's useful. And if you do that, then you get the joy of participating in the game towards victory, but the extra joy of building yourself more and more strongly at the same time. And so when you tell your kid, doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. Your kid says, what do you mean by that? And you say, I don't know. I don't know what I mean by that. Because the kid says, I'm supposed to win, aren't I? It's like, well, yeah. So why does it matter how I play the game? It's like, well, then you're stumped. Even though you're right, you just don't know why. Right. But the reason is you want to tell here's the reason. It's like, you can make this very simple. Life is not a game. It's a series of games. It's actually a series of diverse games. Okay, so who's the winner of the series of diverse games? Because that's the real question, right? Not who wins a game. It's like whatever, you win a game. It's like if I hold a gun to your head and we're playing chess, I can say lose. Yeah. It's like I win. It's like, well, that's not helpful, obviously. So you want to teach your kid, you want to help your kid learn to be the winner of the set of diverse games. Okay, so what does that winner look like? Well, here's the first clue. That's the person who keeps getting invited to play. So because you win. If people invite you to play all the time, you have opportunities coming to you just nonstop. And maybe, like, let's say you have 50 opportunities and each of them are potentially 50% for you and 50% for the other person. You think, well, that's a pretty good deal. And then you think, well, wait a minute, let's flip this around. So it's like 60% for the other person and 40% for me. I'm going to go overboard in the generosity. You think, well, then what happens? Well, then instead of having 20 opportunities at every moment, you have like 50 opportunities at every moment. And that's what you want for your kids, is you want all the invisible doors around them to open. And you do that by saying, play nobly, right? Pay attention to your teammates. Pass the damn puck so they get a chance, right? Even if you're the best player on the team, help the people on your team develop. Don't grandstand, right? If you have the opportunity to beat your opponent 20-1, in goals, it doesn't happen very often, but it can, especially when kids are playing. It's like, well, maybe after you're up 7-1, it's like, back off a bit. You don't have to humiliate your opponents. It's because it's what would you say? It's contemptible behavior on your part. And so, you know that because you go and watch a hockey game or something like that, and you watch a kid that really knows how to play. It's like they're playing like mad to win. They're pushing themselves to be better, but they're paying attention to their damn teammates, and they respect their opponents. And you think, well, that's a hell of a kid there. It's like, yeah, that's exactly right. That kid's going somewhere. What you want to do is, for your child, is that you want the best for the best in them. That's what you want. And that's what you want from people that you surround yourself with. Now, they'll hold you to a high standard if that's the case, right? Because whenever you degenerate in any of the multiple ways that you're likely to degenerate, they're going to whack you on the back of the head and say, clue the hell in. You're demeaning yourself. You're less than you could be. And there's real judgment in that, and it's harsh. But with friends, it's the same thing. You want friends. They're not friends if they're not these people. You want friends who, when something good happens to you, that's good for you, right? They're happy about that. They're not all bitter and resentful underground and saying horrible things behind your back and telling you how they did something that was better and trying to drag you down. It's that's not helpful. And then when something bad happens to you and you go to them and you say, look, this terrible thing happened to me. First of all, they don't try to top it with some horrible thing that happened to them because they don't have the patience to listen. And second, they're not secretly gloating about the fact that catastrophe finally befell you. It's they're actually hurt by it. And that chapter is an injunction. Is take a look at the people that are around you. And if they're not on the side of what's good for you, then walk away. Because, well, first of all, that's best for them too. If you put up with that, all you're doing is enabling it. It's well, it's okay that you mistreat me in a way that's harmful to me and everyone else. It's actually, no, that is not okay. It's not the least bit okay. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to help someone when they're down. That's a whole different issue.